Well, good morning, Highlands. My name is Josh, and I'm one of the pastors on staff here at the church. And today we start a new summer series. I feel like it's fun to be able to kick off the summer series because it feels like summer is finally here, despite the weather not feeling like summer is here. But this summer we're walking through the Psalms and walking through a few select Psalms, looking and asking the question, who do the Psalms say our God is? We're gonna be taking some select Psalms and seeing a unique aspect of God's character and his relationship with us. We'll see how he's our light, our redeemer, our champion, our glory, our king, and our refuge. And each week we'll kind of take a different look at that. Today we're in Psalm 65. So if you have your Bibles, go ahead and turn there. If you don't have a Bible, there's one provided in front of you, right underneath the seat in front of you. You can go to page 505. That's where it is there. And you will see the psalm we're studying today. This psalm is written by King David. You'll notice under the title, there's a little subtitle that will let you know about this. David himself, one of the most prolific kings of Israel, has written this as a song of praise to the Lord. I find it amazing that David is this king who has conquered and done unbelievably awesome things. He defeated Goliath, he conquered nations, he did awesome things, and he wrote songs. He was this mighty king, and he would sit down and play the harp. He's just kind of a Renaissance man in that way. But David, you'll see in this song, is taking a moment to reflect on a great harvest year. He's taking a moment to reflect on the way that God has worked in the year. Most likely this was written in the fall when they would collect a lot of the harvest. And you'll see in verses 9 through 13, he's appreciating it. David's taking that moment where you do something really difficult. Maybe you have some sort of project and then you take a minute to just appreciate its work. I don't know if you like doing yard work, but sometimes when I mow, and my yard's like tiny, and I have one of those push mowers that are like manual and were built probably in like the 60s or something. But when I mow, I like to take a step back and just look at the yard and just see if I made things straight and just appreciate, man, the yard looks good right now. The weeds are very short because I chopped them down, and I can appreciate it, right? And just sit back. I have a neighbor who just his yard looks amazing, and I'll see him out there all day long, and he works really, really hard and then just spends like tons of time because I'll walk one direction, come back, and he's just standing there appreciating it, just soaking it in. Maybe for you, you've remodeled a house this year and you've kind of done something different, and you're taking some time to just appreciate and sit back. Maybe you like to clean the house, get it all organized, and you take the 5 minutes that you get before it wrecks up again to appreciate the fact that it's clean for a moment, right? And that it's all organized. Maybe there's a business year that you've had that's good, and you're able to sit back and look at the beautiful spreadsheets and the ways that profits have been good, and maybe your grades have been better, or whatever it is. Do you like to do hard work and then appreciate what's happened? That's what David is doing here. He's taking a step back, and he's looking at the rain and the grain and the pastures and the hills. All this is within 9 through 13, the flocks that God has given him. He's appreciating the harvest year. And what David wants us to see is that God is our provider. God is our provider. That God has given all of these very good things to us. And so if God is our provider, we may ask the question, what does God provide? And if you're like me, do you go to verses 9 through 13 and say, this is what God provides? The rain, the grain, showers, all of these awesome provisions, all of these awesome gifts that God gives us. And I would say, yes, that's part of it for sure. God gives good things to us. He provides for us. God provides our needs. He gives us jobs. He gives us finances. He gives us food. He gives us health. God provides for us. And I think a practical part of this text is that God does provide over us like a father giving to his children. In Philippians 4:6, Paul tells us to let our requests be known to God. That we have requests, that we should give them over to him and allow him to provide. In Matthew 6:31, Jesus tells us to not be anxious about anything, but to trust that the Lord will provide. In 1 Peter 5:7, Peter tells us to cast our anxieties on God because he cares. And in Luke 11, it shows us, Jesus shares with us that God is a good God who gives good gifts to his children. So if you're hurting today, if you are in need, if you feel like you just need God to show up, the good news for you is that our God is a provider, that he gives good gifts, that he knows, he cares, and he gives. And I think this psalm shares that and shows us something else behind the giving of provisions, behind the giving of gifts that is good for us to understand and know that not only is God a good provider of things, but he provides himself. Look at verse 4. It says at the very end, it says, we will be satisfied with the goodness of your house, the holiness of your temple. David is saying, we're gonna be satisfied with what? Him, with the Lord. It doesn't say we will be satisfied with the things that are to come in verses 9 through 13. We're gonna be satisfied with the flock, with the hills, with the crowning of the goodness of the year, of the showers. It doesn't say that. It says we will be satisfied with the goodness of who God is, not the goodness of money. Not the goodness of obedient kids and a great marriage and a nice home with a picket fence and all the things that a good life could provide. Yes, those are good things that God gives, but there's something else that he gives. And this is the main idea that I want us to see, that behind all of that, God provides his presence. God provides his presence to his people. Not only does he give the provision, not only does he give all of these awesome things, but he gives his presence, that those things point back to his presence. And we can see this in the way that David constructs this song. If you look at verse 1 through 4, you see that people are gathering into the temple. This was the place in Jerusalem where the people would experience the presence of God. They would there give sacrifices. They would worship in the courts, as he mentions in this section. They would celebrate. They would atone for their sins, and they would experience his presence in what's called the Holy of Holies. And then from there, you will notice after verse 4, the way that David constructs this psalm shifts. It goes from them celebrating in the temple to him expounding on the greatness of God. Almost every single verse begins with you. You do this. You provide in this way. You show up in this way. It's as if David is sitting and the people are sitting in the presence of God, basking in his presence. And then from there, they are seeing the ways that God has shown up. Have you ever sat under the presence of something, and as you kind of took it in, you began to realize more and more the implications of it? A few years ago, we used to take our students during summer camp to Natchez, Washington. And right before lights out, we would spend just a brief period of time going out to this field where students would be able to stargaze. In the actual camp location that we were at, there was no light pollution. So you were able to see the stars in just like as if it were a painting in the sky. And it was just incredible. And when people would sit down and they would look up and they'd kind of be looking at the sky and seeing stars, shooting stars, and at times you could see satellites and planets potentially, and it was just unbelievably awesome to see. You began to see how leaders and students would start talking, which isn't really shocking for teenagers to be talking in a moment that's kind of cool, but they would be talking about what they're seeing in just the beauty of the stars. Leaders are pointing out different constellations, different stars that they're seeing, and you just kind of hear the awesomeness and the implications of it all. That's somewhat what's happening here. Then in verses 1-4, the people of God sit under the presence of God, and then from there you begin to see how awesome is it, the way that he works. So what do we see as we sit in the presence of God and this thing that he provides in his goodness? What do we see? I think there's 3 things from this text that we see that we can begin to realize in our own life. The first one is God's power. Second is his posture. And the last one is his provision. God's power, posture, and provision. Let's look at the first one, in God's power. Look at the way that David talks about God's active work in the world. In verses 5-13, you see that God is active in providing, in sharing and showing his glory and awesomeness. God is the one who does things that we can't do. There is a tier of power and strength that David points out to us that we can take awe and reference in. Look at verse 6. It says, you establish the mountains. Think about how crazy that is. Have you ever tried to establish a mountain? Have you ever tried to push a mountain? They don't move at all. I don't even know where you'd start. But God, in his strength, as if the mountains were like Legos, takes them and places them where he wants. He has taken Mount Rainier and he has placed it where he desires. God established the mountains. He silences the ocean in verse 7. That is a difficult thing to do. You know how much noise the ocean creates? You can't even talk with someone when you're sitting there at the beach, right? It's like if you get closer and closer, it's difficult. There's the roar, the white noise of all the different sounds. He says that he water and prepare the earth in verse 9. For all the technology that we have, we can't do that. We have no idea when the rain and wind will come. It could be beautiful for a moment, right? We know this from this past week. It can be gorgeous, and then the next moment, it's hailing, and it's thundering and lightning like yesterday, right? For all of our advancement, we can't control it. We can't do anything about it. The most that we can do is jump on our weather app and see that it looks like it's gonna rain in 30 minutes, which means that it's probably actually gonna rain in like an hour when you don't want it to rain because it's never actually accurate. But we can't control it. God can. And in this psalm, it shows us that God is active in that he is over things like that. It says that you crown the year in verse 11. It's as if the year is like a crown, and he is taking that year and placing a jewel in that crown to say, this year is good, that God is not powerless to time. God's presence shows us that we have a God who is active, in control, that he is sovereign over all things, that he uses people and the created order to be able to work out his good plan in the world and in your life. God is not shocked. He is not surprised. He is not intimidated by anything. There is nothing within this world that God is nervous about. There's nothing in this world where that God begins to wonder, is this going to turn out in the way that I hoped it would turn out? No, God establishes it. God creates it. God works within it. And David wants us to understand that. And a true understanding of God's power, of his greatness, of encountering this presence of his power creates a spirit within us, a disposition within us of hope, not fear. It creates a disposition of peace, a personality that rests. As it says in verse 5, that he's the God of our salvation, the hope of all the ends of the earth and of the distant seas. Now compare this text to the story of Jesus and the disciples encountering the storm on the Sea of Galilee. If you go to Matthew 8 at verses 23 through 27, you'll see that the disciples and Jesus set out onto the Sea of Galilee. And Jesus, as they set out, goes down to the bottom of the boat to sleep. As they are there on the boat and on the sea, a massive storm rises up. Now, when I was younger, I would read that story and I'd be like, that can't be that big of a deal. Like, it's probably because I watched too many VeggieTales or Sunday school stories. It just kind of felt like, nah, that's not that big of a deal. But the disciples, it says, they literally were so afraid that they were proclaiming that this is when they were going to die, that the sea was overwhelming them. This is not just a small lake. This is a massive body of water that's going to overwhelm them. They feel as if they're going to be taken out. It's the end. And Jesus is asleep in the bottom of the boat. And Jesus is like hitting his REM cycle at the bottom of the boat while they're about to die. And so they're like, what's happening? And so they go down to the bottom. They're like, Jesus, wake up. We're gonna die. You're gonna die. It's over. And if you notice in the story, Jesus doesn't respond with fear. He gets up, goes to the top of the boat, and commands the ocean to be silent. Why? He has the ability to silence the roar of the seas. He silences all anxiety and fear because he's in control over it all. Now, we may not have a physical storm in our life right now that is as impending as what the disciples were experiencing, but we have a lot of relational, personal, mental, and emotional storms that fill our life, right? You may be in this room today and you're experiencing joblessness, a really difficult diagnosis. Are you experiencing a wayward child, a struggling relationship, a loss of a relationship? David wants to encourage us today that though we may not know how it ends, though it may feel as if everything's out of control, it's not, because our God is in control. And as we rest in his presence, we will understand and see that he has established all things with his hands. So the question is, how do we know that we're truly trusting? What are indicators within our life that tell us that we have hope and not fear? How do I know that I am trusting in his presence, I am trusting in his power, and I'm grabbing onto this? Look at verse 8. After there's all of these awesome things that have been brought out about the power of God and his amazing might, it says that those who live far away are awed by your signs. You make east and west shout for what? Joy. The more and more that we understand the presence of God, the more and more that we will have awe and joy. The more we will praise, as it states in verse 1, the power of God and his greatness and his mighty work. We will know we are trusting. A symptom of us trusting and knowing and hoping in his power and might is that our words will be praising his mighty name despite the storm that we're facing in life. So my question for you today is, are we talking about him to other people? When we have conversations with others, when we're encouraging other people, when we're just going about our day, do our words have a certain weight to them, understanding that God is powerful, that he's in control? They're not filled with nervousness and fear. They're filled with hope and positivity that he will redeem and hold all things. Do we have moments where we appreciate his power and might throughout the day? That as we're going about our day, just under our breath, we're just praising him for the beauty of so many things around us. Do we find time in our calendar to just simply thank him, to praise him, to take in his power, strength, and might? Because the more and more that we realize something is good and powerful, the more that we'll appreciate it, that we'll talk about it. We see God's power at work in his presence, and that power gives us a spirit of hope, not fear. The second thing that we see here is God's posture in this text, God's posture towards his people. Have you ever felt uninvited by someone? Maybe you went over to their home and you walked in and it just like immediately kind of felt like, this is awkward. The way that they're responding to me, the nonverbal cues, I just am not really welcome there. Maybe on the flip side, you walk into someone's home and they've definitely been expecting you. Like they get the coffee, they've had cookies baking in the oven and they welcome you, they ask you to sit down. You feel extremely comfortable there. You know, like I am welcome here. There's a certain posture, there's a certain countenance of that person that they're welcoming you in. I worked at a hospital right before I went into ministry years ago, right when my wife and I got married. And I had the great job of having to go around to hospital rooms and have people sign papers. And believe it or not, when people are in the hospital, they don't really want someone just randomly walking in their room and having them sign papers as they're recovering. So it was a really fun job. But there was times where I'd walk into the room and I could just tell this is not going to go well. And so I'd have to try to do everything that I could because I was like, man, this person, like they're not going to receive this well, and I don't blame them. There's other times that people would be like, they would understand, and they would be, despite the pain that they were experiencing, they would be super open, friendly, and welcome. And I knew, okay, I could have a conversation with this person. God's posture towards us is more like that than negative, off-putting, a stiff arm towards us. And David shows us that in this text. He shows us that God's posture is two things towards us. It's kind and it's gracious. Look at verse 5. God's posture is kind. He says that he answers us. That God sits down, meets us at our eye level, and speaks to us. That God answers us, that he visits us in verse 9, that he visits the earth and he works in it. He doesn't just stay high above, kind of hanging out in some sort of realm where we don't know where he's at, what he's doing, how he's working. He's active, he is visiting, he is aware of what's going on, he knows. It says in verse 10 that he softens the world with showers. He doesn't just take the rain and throw it at the earth. There you go. He softens it. There is a countenance to the Lord in which he is approaching his created order with softness. In verses 12 through 13, it says that he clothes the world, that he robes it in verses 12 through 13. Not only is it kind, but it's also gracious. Not only is he friendly, not only is he nice, but he is gracious. It says in verse 9 that he is giving to the earth this water, but he's doing so abundantly and greatly, that he is soaking the earth. In verse 11, it says that there is an overflow with plenty. Another way to understand this would be, it's talking about like this cart that's on the road. It says, you crown the year with goodness, your carts overflow with plenty. Another way to think about it would be as if the paths that the carts were on have fat on them because the carts are just dripping with fat. It's like a really good piece of meat that you cook. It's like a brisket that is so tender. It's just dripping with fat that you know that's going to be good. It's not just some random piece of meat that you have no idea, like what is this gonna be? And it's just, not dripping with fat, but it's dripping with fat. So what's David telling us? God is gracious to you. He doesn't just give us the bare minimum. He is gracious, good, and kind. He celebrates. This is reflected in the story of the prodigal son in Luke chapter 15. We see Jesus share a story in which there's these two brothers. One brother looks at his father and says, I would rather that you would no longer be alive, and I'm gonna go take your inheritance and just do whatever I want with it. And so the father lets him go. And he goes off into a city, he spends it all and kind of comes to the end of himself because he doesn't have anything left. And then he realizes in a moment that he needs to go back to his father. He has nothing else left. and he hopes that his father will accept him as a worker of his house. And so he goes back to the house expecting that probably punishment, but at least that his father would treat him like one of the hired hands of his home. But in Luke 15, Jesus shares with us as an illustration of God's posture towards us, that the Father drops everything, runs to the Son, which at that time culturally would have been just an amazing thing to see, runs to the Son, embraces him, calls out to everyone that they're gonna throw a party, that they're gonna bring out the good food, that they're gonna take the good jewelry and they're gonna bring it out because the son that was lost was now found. He doesn't just look at the son and say, you're welcome to have a chair in the back corner and you can work as a hired hand, that you can have some sort of shed in the back and you can live there and then you're cool and we're good. No, he brings him back as a son, celebrates him coming home, and graciously elevates him to a place where honestly we would probably feel he doesn't belong. And David is echoing that idea that God gives graciously towards us, that he gives his good gifts, that he gives his presence in such a way, his spirit in such a way that is abundant, that is over the top. And to be honest, it shouldn't be this way. God's posture towards us is good because God's posture towards us shouldn't be this kind and gracious. David remarks in verse 3 that God, as they sit in the temple, atones for their rebellion. David feels this feeling of iniquity that overwhelm him. That as he sits in the presence of God, he sees his sin. He sees his transgression. He sees the faults that he has made against the Lord. He doesn't feel like he should be there, but thank the Lord because God atones for his rebellion. See, David is in the remark about the rebellion is pointing back to all of our rebellion that we have committed against the Lord, that we've seen in the created order. In Genesis 1-3, we see God creates the world in perfection, that he makes man and woman good. And he creates a relationship between us that allows for him to be in perfect unity with one another. But we went our own way. We rebelled, as he states here. We decided that we wanted our own rules. We wanted our own way of living. We wanted to do what we wanted to do. And so we walked away from that. But he doesn't leave us there. It says in verse 4 that he brings us near to live. That through the sacrifice of his son, that God became man, lived the perfect life to be the perfect sacrifice, died on the cross, and in so doing, became the clean sacrifice on our behalf so that we may enter into his presence. He atoned, he washed us clean. He walked past our rebellion. He cleaned us up so that we could have our relationship with him, so that in verse 2, all humanity can come to him. That no matter who you are, no matter what race, no matter what background, no matter what resume, rap sheet, familial background, no matter what, you are able to stand in the presence of God because of what Christ has accomplished on the cross. And that this is a free gift that we receive. And that's how we enter into his presence. That God's posture towards us is open. It's inviting. It's accepting. It brings in those who are far away near. That's why he talks about the East and West knowing his name. Dane Ortlund, who wrote the book Gentle and Lowly, said this about Jesus. He said, meek, humble, gentle. Jesus is not trigger happy. He's not harsh. He's not reactionary. He's not easily exasperated. He is the most understanding person in the universe. The posture most natural to him is not a pointed finger, but open arms. God's posture towards us is gracious and kind, despite the rebellion that we have done against him. Not only do we see God's power and his posture, but we also see at the very end here, his provision, God's provision. Again, as we stated earlier, and I just want to reiterate again, God provides. We have a good God who provides for our needs, that is aware and is working in our lives to be able to provide for what we need. Jesus reiterates this over and over again through the Gospels, that we can seek first his kingdom and all the things will be added to you, that we can seek his presence and all the things that we need can be added to us. God provides for our needs. There's an old story that I grew up hearing that I thought was just a great illustration for God's provision and his goodness. There was a man by the name of George Mueller who ran an orphanage in England. And the orphanage had 300 children in the orphanage. And one night, they began to realize that they didn't have any food to be able to provide for the children. Can you imagine 300 children? That's a lot of food and milk that needs to be provided. But they realized we need to pray because we don't have it right here. We need God to show up in a really big way. And so he gets the children together and they all sit down and they pray for God to show up. And the night goes and nothing happens. And so the next morning they get a knock at the door. And at the door is this baker that was in the city. And he says, hey, I have a bunch of leftover bread. Do you want it? Do you guys have need for it? And he's like, yeah, we have 300 hungry kids. Thank you. And then moments later, a milk cart breaks down right outside the orphanage. And the milkman comes over to the orphanage and says, I have a bunch of milk that is gonna spoil if we don't do something with it. Do you want it? And he's like, yeah, I have 300 thirsty children right here, ready to receive. God provides. He provides good gifts for his children. We see him provide for the Israelites in the wilderness by giving them manna throughout their time journeying. We see him give to the hungry people as he preaches on the hilltops and they're looking for fish and bread, and he miraculously gives it to them. And God provides for us in giving us food, water, clothing, relationships, and people in our life. We shouldn't miss that. God provides for us. My question for you, for me, is are we looking for extravagant provisions? Are we looking for big things in our life? And we're missing out on the day-to-day ways that God is providing for us in everyday life. Are we hoping that God does something miraculous and awesome? Are we hoping for that really, really big promotion? And we're praying to God in that way. We're hoping that he helps us get that promotion. Maybe we haven't been studying for a test and then we're now praying for the A. And like, Lord, tomorrow, give me all the knowledge of things that I should have known right now to get the A. And we're hoping just that he shows up in a really big way. God, give me the spouse that I want. May they just show up and I receive the spouse that I need, whatever it is. Are we praying in a way that we're hoping that God provides big and awesome, in which he can do, but maybe he's not answering us in the way that we hope. Maybe we don't get the promotion. Maybe we don't get that person. Maybe we don't get the money that we're looking for, the big gift, the big thing, the extravagant, grandiose way that we're hoping that he shows up. And then we wonder, is he not working in my life? All the while, he's doing these awesome, amazing things to sustain, to give, to allow us to live and thrive in life. There's a song by a Christian worship artist called Has It Been You? And in it, he says that I concede that eternity is pressing into time. even the material, it hums with the divine. Then he says this, I believe the miraculous mundane is still begging to be seen. The singer was essentially looking back on his life and wondering, have I been missing out on the mundane, usual things that God has been providing for me day in and day out? Food, water, clothing, a roof over our head. The fact that we are the exact distance from the sun to be able to live and thrive. And am I looking for a big, massive miracle when the real miracle is right here every day? God provides, and he does so day in and day out for our life. He's a good God who gives to his children. And so we ask, we enter into prayer, we enter into his presence, not to receive the provision in and of itself, but to be able to experience the presence of the Creator, so that we may be able to get to know the gift giver, not the gift itself. The band's gonna make their way forward, but I'll leave you with this one last question. God provides his presence. God gives us the ability to be able to sit and be in his presence. Are you making time? Am I making time to just simply be in his presence? Are our prayers that are asking him for things, or are just wanting to be with him? God gives us his presence. He allows us to see his power at work. He accepts us and brings us in as a loving father who is kind and gracious, and he gives good gifts to us. Let us enter into his presence as a people who want to know and love him. Let me pray, and we will sing out one last song. God, thank you for this psalm and the way that you remind us how you provide and the way that you give your presence and your spirit to your people. May we just sit and reflect on your power, the ways that you have worked. May we praise and be in awe of who you are, your character and nature, and may we speak about it in our day-to-day life. In your name we pray, amen. Would you stand as we sing out this last song this morning?